Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Lynn Wood. I'm a student services assistant at East Los Angeles College, and I am the new coordinator for a center called One Zone. It's a support and retention center for our LGBTQ students. This is my partner, Anne. She's going to read for us today, and I will as well. I have a few books here. I'm going to talk about one of them and then read from one of them also. But I just wanted to share with you, hope the start of your fall semester has gone well and you're off to a great start. And if you need support, please do not hesitate to reach out. There's plenty of support for you. I know it's a little strange because we're in this virtual world, but there's support for you. And if you're having a hard time navigating the system that is set up, which is ConnexEd or Cranium Cafe, it can be a little challenging. So if you send me an email, I would be more than happy to help you navigate where you need to go in the system. So my email is wood, that's WOOD, CL, that's wood, CL, @elac.edu. Okay, and my name is Lynn, last name is Wood. Feel free to send me any questions that you have and I will help you navigate. If you could just give me a brief scenario or synopsis of where you're trying to go, what you're trying to do, and I'll help best navigate you. Okay, I do have 2 cats and a dog, so you might see them in this production. Because the cat that really loves Zoom, her name is Pilar, and I see her coming this way now.
Maybe she'll keep
Just so you
walking.
guys know. I got this book this week. It's called Full Disclosure by Cameron Garrett. I'm not going to read from this today, but I wanted to show it to you just so you are aware of it. She wrote this book when she was 17, so really, you know, anything's possible, and it discusses HIV and awareness for HIV. So that will be coming up at some point.
It's your first publication too.
Yes, yes. But the book I wanted to talk to you about today is Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene Carruthers.
So I can get my hand on it.
And her photo is in the back jacket cover. Ooh. Sorry, I was tilting there. And it says that she spent a decade developing leaders, that she's a Black lesbian feminist, a founding national director of BYP 100, which is Black Youth Project 100. It's an organization of young activists in the movement for Black liberation, and that her work has been featured in various news outlets, and that she was born and raised and resides currently on the south side of Chicago. So her experience in speaking in this book is from that side of the world, not California, like Chicago.
Chicago-like.
Yeah, like Chicago. And we've been reading this book a few Tuesdays now. Sorry, I got stuck because I was trying to see, like, oh, I see. Here's where we get to acknowledgments. So it is a few pages. We probably won't finish it today, sorry. Okay. I'm on page 114. And historian Darla Clark-Hine describes Chicago's Black communities as a collection of Northern Southerners and Southern Northerners, meaning that migrants held dual experience as a result of the community makeup. Black organizing in Chicago draws on traditions and tactics of the South and the North. This means we are able to move slowly and quickly. It means we can hunker down for long-term campaigns and turn up because it's a Tuesday. And like our city, the movement is windy. Situations can change quickly. Alliances are not always obvious, and a boundary can be crossed without you even knowing it. Today, Chicago is the site of campaigns that illuminate the impact of policing on Black women, that call for deep investment in our communities, that demand an end to state-sanctioned violence. Together, people and groups of differing political orientations have come together using various tactics and won battles. From the Trauma Center's campaign success to the hunger strike and organizing that led to keeping Dite High School open, to the 2016 ousting of Cook County State Attorney Anita Alvarez for a pattern of mishandling cases. Our calls to stop the cops and fund Black future recognize the heavy impact of poverty, violence, and trauma upon Black Chicagoans. Organizers took to the streets in 2015 when the city hosted the conference of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, bringing over 14,000 police chiefs from across the world to Chicago. Wow. BYP 100, or Black Youth Project 100, which is the organization that she heads, in collaboration with groups including Asata's Daughters, We Charge Genocide, Not One More, Organized Communities Against Deportation, and Lifted Voices, led a civil disobedience action to shut down the opening events of the conference. The conference was returning to Chicago. It had hosted its first conference there in 1893.
What?
And its original purpose still held, serving as a means to apprehend and return criminals who have fled agency jurisdictions in which they were wanted. Would you like to hear that again? Yeah. Serving as a means to apprehend and return criminals who have fled agency jurisdictions in which they were wanted.
Are they talking about slaves?
They're talking about the police chiefs. She's talking about specifically the police chiefs. She just mentioned 1893 because that was the first time it was hosted in Chicago, but she's talking about how its purpose of that organization of police chiefs is as a means to apprehend and return criminals who have fled agency jurisdiction in which they were wanted. Of course, I think you could read a lot into that.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the,
I think, yeah, goes right
the
directly.
Runaway Slave Act, I believe, something like that.
That's immediately what it made me think, like that ambiguous language that they try and hide the shit in.
Just keep perpetuating the same nonsense throughout history.
Yeah, it's crazy. We understood that the conference was true to its roots in the 19th century patrols formed to capture enslaved Africans seeking freedom. Well, see, there you go. And we intended to send a message to the Chicago Police Department, the IACP, and the broader organizing community. On October 24th, 2015, we locked down 4 blockades inside and outside of McCormick Place, the site of the police conference. We understood this convention to be a gathering of minds to plot out the continued domination of Black people around the world. 66 of us were arrested that day. It was the biggest investment in direct action and civil disobedience that BYP 100 had ever made. The goal, as in any strategic civil disobedience, was not to be arrested for the sake of theater. The goal was to demonstrate how far we were individually willing to go to call out the systemic violence of policing in the world and to demand investment in Black communities and defunding of police. Despite intensive preparation and the large scale of the action, many people have never heard of it. Yeah, had you heard of it? I hadn't heard of it.
So I'm sorry,
This convention that took place in Chicago.
What year?
2015.
Kind of sounds familiar.
Commitments from partners fell through. We failed to have backup plans on the ground. It was a lesson in need to invest in strategic communications just as much as we did in everything else. That action gave birth to our Stop the Cops and Fund Black Futures campaign. BYP 100 brought in members from New York and DC. Our newly formed Detroit chapter allied organizations and trainers from the Blackout Collective to support the action. In this collaboration, we learned and gained capacity to work together. And the efforts of the Black Direct Action can be seen in organizing to this day. Getting to the point where we could collaborate on a large-scale action, however, took months of work and relationship building. When BYP 100 entered the Chicago organizing community after its founding in 2013, we were met with mixed reactions. Many people supported us and found our group of young Black people refreshing and inspirational. But many of us were queer, transgender, or gender nonconforming, and women, and thus we were also met with distrust. BYP 100 members in Chicago and chapters forming in Washington, D.C., New York City, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Philadelphia made the decision to build a membership-based organization. We choose to use conventional organizing methods, including building a membership base and providing skill training. We also choose to organize methods rooted in cultural work, investing in young people's leadership at every level of the organization, and Black feminist ideology in an organization of all genders. We could have made different choices, but we did not, because we believed that our method was a true path to transformation. In doing so, we made interventions that shifted the organizing climate in Chicago and across the nation. And we learned many lessons from the mistakes we made along the way. I had moved back to Chicago from New York City around 6 months before our founding. Very few people knew who I was, and in true Chicago fashion, I was met with mostly reasonable skepticism. I remember boarding the shuttle to the BYP 100 founding convening and being met with looks that said, "Who is she? Why is she the bus captain?" Had someone said to me, "Here's what you need to accomplish by 2015, I would have turned around and walked the other way. I remember leaving Ferguson, Missouri during the uprising there, earlier than many other comrades, to get back to our very first direct action targeting the Chicago Police Department. It was August 2014. The one action calling for CPD, that's Chicago Police Department, to decriminalize marijuana led to a long-term engagement with the third largest police department in the United States. CPD's leaders and other city officials would get to know our work well as we led and joined efforts across the city to expose police corruption and the systemic violence perpetuated by the institution. BYP 100 joined a collection of groups led by young Black people, including a mixture of born and raised Chicagoans, transplants, and native transplants like myself, who had grown up in the city, yet had never organized there. Some groups had sprung up in the aftermath in the killings of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown. Others, like Fearless Leaders by the Youth, which acronym is FLY, Fearless Leaders by the Youth, that's cute, created years before, aimed to secure justice and community investment after the death of a comrade. BYP 100's work didn't end with our efforts focused on the Chicago Police Department. our organization joined the fight for 15 campaigns locally and nationally. And we brought new leaders to work on its international efforts to mandate a living wage across industries disproportionately employ Black people. We joined forces with organizations including OCAD and Mahinte in the struggle to end the criminalization and deportation of immigrants. The work did not begin with BYP 100. There is a long legacy of anti-policing, organizing, and community building in Chicago. For example, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, formed in 1973 out of the mass movement to free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. The Black Panther Party Chicago chapter laid groundwork for cross-movement collaboration, and the 1969 assassination of Chicago Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark show that Chicago had long been a state of repression against our movement, had long been a site of state repression against our movement. I was not present in the development of every campaign and effort discussed in this chapter. I am positive that individuals closest to the work will find my accounts insubstantial. My intention, though, is to highlight what I have learned and observed as an organizer and history nerd in order to illustrate unique paths of community organizing in Chicago since the 1970s. I've worked alongside people young and old who know this history better than I do because they were there.
Mm-hmm.
Between 1972 and 1991, the next section says reparations won, and then it says between 1972 and 1991, Chicago Police Department Commander John Burge, police detectives under his command tortured Black people, including women and over 100 men, in part to elicit confessions. Their tactics included electric shock and suffocation. This abuse, sanctioned torture, resulted in forced confessions and long prison sentences and death sentences for people taken into custody in the CPD's Area 2 and 3, both predominantly Black neighborhoods. There are still men in prison today who were convicted under confessions after torture. I've met at least one torture victim serving a sentence during a visit to Stateville Prison in 2016. I've also met Daryl Cannon, who spent 20 years in prison after a forced... Ooh, girl, that choked me. Sorry, I gotta get a drink. Our cat did something stupid, it made me choke. And cat's great like that. I'm one of those like illiterate people, I guess, is even as the amount of books I've read, I haven't heard of a lot of the stuff that she's talking about for Chicago. It's kind of before my time, but I should know about it.
Well, I have watched a lot of documentaries on Black history on PBS and so forth. So I have heard, I'm a little more familiar with some stuff maybe.
For some reason, it made me think about Eyes on the Prize.
Yes. And do you know that they don't show that anymore?
I was just going to say what a tragedy that is.
The only time they used to show it was in February, obviously, because they don't know how to show it any other time. And but I'd be like, oh, they're going to show it. And then the gentleman, the African-American gentleman who was the producer on it, passed away. And that's it. They did. Because I was wondering, how come You know, how come they don't have it anymore? Because he passed away. But they were great documentaries.
Yeah, they were. So,
And now Henry Gates Jr., professor at Harvard, I believe.
oh, that's right, his series.
Yeah, his series. He's got like 3 different series going on TV. But Africans in America, how the history of African civilizations throughout time. Okay, genealogy, it's crazy. But anyway, I'm a big fan of his.
Yeah, see that, your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thinking something. Oh, reparations, death sentence. Still men in prison, torture victims, Statesville. Daryl Cannon, who spent 20 years in prison after a forced confession. CPD detectives subjected Cannon to torture in 1983, enacted mock executions by stuffing a shotgun in his mouth, hit him with a rubber hose, and shocked his testicles with a cattle prod.
Oh, fuck no.
The sadism was something that they like doing, said Cannon.
It doesn't stop, man.
It's disgusting. These injustices were met with resistance by torture victims, their family members, and community members. But the journey for justice has been a long haul, and has involved dozens of organizations, legal activists, artists, groups such as the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. The innovative effort spans decades. Through many tactics, the efforts focused on building Burge, the officers under his command, public officials, and the city of Chicago accountable for the physical, mental, and spiritual violence inflicted as elected officials, including the often celebrated Mayor Richard M. Daley, stood by and did nothing. Throughout the 1980s, over 50 organizations, including Citizens Alert and the Task Force to Confront Police Violence, led consistent actions outside City Hall. In 2004, a coalition including ex-gang member and civil rights attorney Standish Willis decided to tell the story on an international audience. Willis felt that they could make the torture case international and embarrass the United States. Indeed, the United Nations did call on the US government to investigate. Black people had taken various causes to the United Nations in the past. That tactic can strip the supposed moral superiority of the United States as unfounded, and such international exposure can produce effective results. Winning a reparations campaign was deemed impossible by many, but Willis and Black People Against Police Torture also birthed the idea that Chicago police torture victims should demand reparation. Today's demand for reparations for descendants of slavery in the United States is part of a long-standing movement, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, defines reparations as a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments or corporations. In addition to justice, it is a principle of international human rights. And despite successful reparations efforts for other groups of people systematically targeted by violence, including survivors of the Jewish Holocaust, reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans are consistently marginalized in progressive politics. In defense of their anti-reparation stance, white people often proclaim that they didn't own slaves. This position represents not only ignorance of history, but also a failure to recognize and accept how they continue to benefit from slavery. The terrorism of Jim Crow in the South, the violence of economic oppression and poverty in the North, the so-called war on drugs, and today's prison industrial complex all support the argument for reparations to address centuries of domination of Black Americans. The Police Torture Victims Reparations Campaign addresses both the needs of people injured and the need for systemic changes to improve the material condition of Black communities in Chicago. It builds on previous successful campaigns led by torture victims inside and outside of prison. For example, 10 police torture victims who called themselves the Death Row 10 in the first years of the new millennium successfully collaborated with the campaign to end the death penalty and the Illinois coalition to abolish the death penalty. Their organizing resulted in Illinois Governor George Ryan commuting the sentences of all death row inmates and pardoning the 4 of the 10 men in 2003. Wow. All of that from behind prison walls. Look what you can accomplish if you really set your mind to it and you work towards it. I'm sure it took a really long time, but they were able to accomplish it.
I read Assata Shakur's book.
Yeah.
Yeah. We should probably read from that. Except it's very
raw.
Yes.
Very raw.
It's not too raw for me, but it might be raw.
Might be raw for the general audience. So, but it's something that you should all read. Assata Shakur's book. You should read it. The Death Row 10.
Because I'm wondering if when she said Assata's children,
yes,
that group, if that was named after Assata.
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
Could be.
That was my assumption.
Yeah. Feel like we don't know everything, so.
Right. As we discussed, organizing for justice in Chicago requires groups of oppressed people to make connection with each other's causes, and for those who are directly affected to lead, even if they are in prison. Oh, see, like I was saying, just because there's walls around you, can't let that limit what you're able to do with your mind. And they're still able, they're behind walls in prison, but they're still able to write letters. They're still able to communicate electronically through email. So you can break down a lot of walls that way.
Maybe now it's not as bad. But if you're a political prisoner, they're not just going to be nice to you.
Yeah, I know.
And especially if they accused you of killing cops.
And the torture and the confinement, the solitary confinement, those are the things they use to break down a person.
Yeah, they'll just kill you.
Isolating and confining. Try to break spirit. And yeah.
And it breaks you down physically as well.
Right. Once the spirit is broken, it breaks your body down. As the police torture victim reparations campaign advanced, many stakeholders and decision makers joined the effort and reached communities across the city. Joey Mogul, the People's Law Office attorney and co-founder of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Project, drafted the original reparations ordinance, which served as a basis for a package introduced to Chicago's City Council by Alderman Howard Brookins and Paco Joe Moreno in 2013. The reparations campaign invited newer legal advocates, cultural workers, advocates, activists, and community organizers to align themselves with the struggle of police torture victims and their families. 2 years later, the campaign was a success. Reparations 1 included a formal apology for the torture by Chicago police during the time of CPD headed by John Burge. specialized counseling services to the torture survivors and their family members on the South Side, free enrollment in City College and job training for survivors and family members, including grandchildren, as well as prioritize access to other City of Chicago programs, including help with housing, transportation, and senior care. A history lesson about the torture cases taught in Chicago public schools to 8th and 10th graders.
Wow.
The construction of a permanent public memorial to the survivors, and $5.5 million set aside for the torture survivors. Seemingly overnight, the campaign slogan, "Reparations Now," was transformed and printed on t-shirts proclaiming "Reparations Won." This was a people's victory, the victory made possible by the tenacity of the people, of the police torture victims and their families. Organized people around a single goal while allowing multiple entry points for people of different generations and races with differing experiences and skills. BYP 100 didn't exist when the struggle for torture justice began, nor did newer organizations such as We Charge Genocide. We became an anchor in the campaign. Young people, many of whom were activated by the Ferguson uprising, boosted the momentum of the reparations campaign. We joined efforts to call city council members, led direct action targeting Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and used social media to raise community awareness. And we won, despite the doubts, which would not have been possible without the work done before many of us became activists and community organizers. Got to remember the folks that came before you. The intentionality to address the needs of individual torture victims and their families was extended to children in Chicago's public schools. The people who crafted the campaign saw that education could help prevent police torture and such atrocities from happening again. The campaign's demand for a community center and mental health support for survivors and their families also points to the structural and long-term changes its organizers sought. Oppressed people and their leaders clearly were looking beyond individual gain while providing a model for what abolition can look like in actual practice. The statement released by Amnesty International USA and the Chicago Justice Memorials, Torture Justice Memorials, Project NIA, and We Charge Genocide describe the significance of the victory beyond the city. Chicago is the first municipality in the history of the United States to ever provide reparations for radically motivated law enforcement violence. In doing so, the City of Chicago is agreeing to acknowledge the city responsibility for gross human rights violations and to commit significant resources to begin to help repair harms inflicted on the torture survivors, their families, and the community they came from. The enactment of this legislation sends a strong message that activism and organizing matter in the ongoing struggle for human rights and social justice. To organize successfully in Chicago means being in it for the long haul. It takes creativity, endurance, and a degree of hardness. To honor our fallen, we do actions no matter the weather, even in middle of frigid winter. Our victories don't come easily or quickly, and the campaign to secure justice for survivors of police torture in Chicago is emblematic. The Chicago organizing community managed to do more than one thing at a time. As the campaign for police torture victims was waged and won, campaigns were underway addressing other areas of structural violence throughout the city. I think that's where I'm going to stop because it goes into another section because we're starting to wind down. Ooh. So I think that's where I'm going to stop.
And do you want to take this?
No.
Okay. Let's get put over here.
I'm going to pass the reading baton over to Anne, and she's going to read to us now.
I'm going to read to you from a book of essays called 43 Septembers by an African American, I believe she's also Latina, writer named Jewelle Gomez. This is she. Of course, that's probably about 20 years ago.
At least, yeah.
Just trying to see where it says about her.
Is it on the back, very back cover?
This doesn't want to say what I wanted to say.
Oh.
Anyway, she currently lives, I believe she's originally from Boston. She lived in San Francisco a while, and she lived in New York. She might live out here now, I'm not sure. But I have met her, and she's a lovely person. And she writes poems and essays and other short stories too. So these are mostly, like, I think ones about her family. She says, my grateful thanks to the many who've helped shape the ideas and words over the months and years, blah, 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 sorry. She dedicates this work to her grandmother, her mother, her father. And the first essay, there's a picture with her and her grandmother, her mother, and her great grandmother. My grandmother Lydia and my mother Dolores were both talking to me from their bathroom stalls in the Times Square movie theater. I was washing the popcorn butter from my hands at the sink, and I didn't think it at all odd. The people in my family are always talking. Conversation is the life force in our world. My great-grandmother Grace would narrate her life story from 7 a.m. until we went to bed at night. The only breaks were when we were reading, or the reverential periods when we sat looking out of our tenement windows, observing the neighborhood, whose sights we naturally talked about later. So it was not odd that Lydia and Dolores were talking nonstop from their stalls, oblivious to everyone except the three of us. I hadn't expected it to happen there. I hadn't really expected it to happen at all. To be a lesbian is part of who I am, like being left-handed. It seemed a fact that needed no articulation. My first encounter with the word bulldagger was not charged with emotional conflict. When I was a teenager in the 1960s, my grandmother told me a story about a particular building in our Boston neighborhood that had gone to seed. She described the building's glorious past through the experience of a party she'd attended there 20 years before. The best part of the evening had been with the women she'd met and danced with. Lydia had been a professional dancer and singer on the Black theater circuit. To dance with women was part of who she was. They danced at the party, then the women walked her home and asked her out. I heard the delicacy of my grandmother's search for the right words, even in the retelling. She had explained to the bulldagger, as she called her, that she liked her fine, but she was more interested in men. As she spoke, I was struck with how careful my grandmother had been to make it clear to that woman, and in effect to me, that there was no offense taken in her attentions, that she just didn't go that way. I was so happy at 13 to have a word for what I knew myself to be. The word was mysterious and curious, as if from a new language that used some other alphabet. It left nothing familiar to cling to when touching its curves and crevices. Now a word existed, though, and my grandmother was not flinching in using it. In fact, she smiled at the good heart and dashing good looks of the bulldagger who had liked her. Once I had the knowledge of a word and a sense of its importance to me, I didn't feel the need to explain, confess, or define my identity as a lesbian. The process of reclaiming my ethnic diversity in this country was already all-consuming, of course. In different situations later on, some political, some not, I did make declarations, but not usually because I had to. Most of they were declarations made to test the waters, a preparation for the rest of the world, which, unlike my grandmother, might not have a grounding in what true love is about. My first lover, the woman who I'd been in my bed once a week through most of our high school years, married when we were 20. After my writings started being published, I told her with my poems that I was a lesbian. She was not afraid to ask what if she'd read about her. She was not afraid to ask if what she'd read was about her and my love for her. So there, amidst her growing children and bowling trophies, I said yes, the poems were about my love for her. She did not pull back, and when I go home to visit my family, I visit her. We sit across the kitchen table from each other, describing our lives and making jokes in the same way we have for over 25 years. During the 1970s, I focused less on having a career than on how to eat and be creative simultaneously. Graduate school and a string of non-traditional jobs, stage manager, midtown messenger, etc., kept me so busy I had no time to think about my identity and its many layers. I was several years before I made the connection between my desire, my social isolation, and the difficulty I had with my writing. I thought of myself as a lesbian between girlfriends, except the between had lasted 5 years. After some anxiety and frustration, I deliberately set about meeting women. Actually, I already knew many women, including my closest friend back then, another Black woman who also worked in theater. I tried opening up to her and explained my frustration at going to the parties we'd attended. I danced with men and keep up a good stream of patter, but inside my mind was racing, speculating on who might be someone I'd really be interested in. All the while, I was too afraid to approach any women I was attracted to, certain I would be rejected because the women were either straight or horrified or lesbian and terrified of being exposed. My friend listened with a pleasant, distant smile. Theoretical homosexuality was acceptable, and male homosexuality was even trendy, but my expression of the complexity and sometimes pain of the situation made her uncharacteristically obtuse, meaning stupid. She became impatient and unsympathetic. I drifted away from her in pursuit of the women's community, a phrase that was not in my vocabulary yet, but I knew it was something more than just women. I fell into that community by connecting with other women writers. Which helped me to focus on my writing as well as on my social life as a lesbian. Yet none of these experiences demanded that I bare my soul. I remained honest but not explicit. Expediency, diplomacy, discretion are the words that come to mind now. At that time, I knew no political framework through which to filter my lesbian experience. I was more preoccupied with the Attica riots than with Stonewall, since the media helps to focus the public's attention within a proscribed spectrum, obscuring the connections between issues. I worried about who would shelter Angela Davis. The concept of sexual politics was remote and theoretical. I'm not certain exactly when and where a theory converged with my reality. Being a Black woman and a lesbian blended unexpectedly for me, like that famous scene in Ingmar Bergman's film Persona. The different faces came together as one, and my desire became part of my heritage, my skin, my perspective, my politics, and my future. I was certain that it had been my past that helped me. I was certain that it had been my past that helped make the future possible. The women in my family had acted as if their lives were meaningful, their lives were art. To be a lesbian among them was to be an artist. Perhaps the convergence came when I saw the faces of my great-grandmother and grandmother and mother and those of the community of women I finally connected with. There was the same adventurous glint in their eyes, the same determined step, the penchant for breaking into song and for not waiting for anyone to take care of them. I needed not to pretend to be other than who I was with any of these women in my family. Did I need to declare it? During the holidays, when I brought home best friends, lovers, my family welcomed us warmly, clasping us to their magnificent bosoms. Yet there was always an element of silence in our neighborhood and in our home. It was disturbing to me, pressing against me more persistently each year. During visits to Boston, it no longer sufficed that Lydia and Dolores were loving and kind to the friend I had with me. Maybe it was just my getting older. Living in New York City at the age of 32 in 1980, there was little I kept deliberately hidden from anyone. Although the genteel silence that hovered around me when I entered my mother's or grandmother's apartments was palpable, I was unsure whether it was really there when I arrived, or if I carried it home within myself. It cut me off from what I knew was a kind of fulfillment available only from my family. The lifeline from Grace to Lydia to Dolores to Jewelle is a strong one. We are bound by so many things, not the least of which is looking so much alike. I was not willing to be orphaned by silence. If the idea of church weddings and station wagons holds no appeal for me, the concept of an extended family is certainly important. But my efforts were stunted by my family's inability to talk about the life I was creating for myself, for all of us. The silence felt all the more foolish because I thought I knew how my family would react. I was confident they would respond with their customary aplomb, just as they had when I first had my hair cut into an afro, which they hated, or when I brought home friends who were vegetarians, which they found curious. While we had disagreed about issues like the fight my mother and I had over Vietnam when I was 19, always when the deal went down, we sided with each other. Somewhere deep inside, I think I believed that neither my grandmother nor my mother would ever censure my choices. Neither had actually raised me. My great-grandmother had done that. Grace had been a steady barricade against any encroachment on our personal freedoms, and she'd rarely disapproved out loud of any considered decision I'd made. But it was not enough to have an unabashed admiration for these women, to have pride in how they so graciously survived in spite of the odds against them was easy. It was something else to be standing in a Times Square movie theater, faced with the chance to say it out loud and risk the loss of their brilliant and benevolent smiles. My mother and I started reading the graffiti written on the wall of the bathroom cubicle. We hooted at each of their dramatic renderings. Then she said, not breaking the rhythm, since we all know timing is everything. We hooted, not is everything. Here's one I haven't seen before. Dykes Unite. There was that profound silence again, as if the frames of my life had ground to a halt in a projector. We were in a freeze frame, and options played themselves out in my head in rapid succession. Say nothing, say something, say what? I laughed and said, yeah, but have you seen the rubber stamp on my desk at home? No, said my mother with a slight bit of puzzlement. What's it say? I saw it, my grandmother called out from her stall. It says lesbian money. What? Lesbian money, Lydia repeated louder over the water in the row of sinks. I just stamp it on my big bills, I said tentatively, and we all screamed with laughter. The other women in the restroom had only been a shadow for me in these moments, but they came into focus as I felt each one press more closely to the sink, trying to pretend that the conversation wasn't happening. Since that night, there has been little said on the subject, yet there have been some awkward moments, usually in social situations where Lydia or Doris feel uncertain. A couple of years after a Times Square encounter, I visited my grandmother for the weekend with my lover. One of the neighbors in her building dropped by, and when she left, my grandmother spoke to me in low tones while my lover was in another room. She said we should be careful about being so open in front of other people because they weren't necessarily as fair-minded as she was. God, she got me. I was flooded momentarily with shock and disappointment. But before I could respond, she heard the words and their incongruity with who she was. She grabbed my arm and demanded, "Forget I said that. Nobody pays rent around this apartment but me." We have not explored it, but the shift in our relationship is clear. I feel free to be an adult, and my family has the chance to see me as such. I'm lucky. My family was as relieved as I was to finally know who I am. Wow.
It was like her grandma heard what she was saying and couldn't believe what she was saying at the same time.
Yeah.
At least she didn't have to wait a long time. It took my mom a good number of years to come around.
And I didn't really talk to my mother about it. I think she always knew. She wasn't surprised when I came around with. So she was just glad I was going to visit her. Did you want me to read another one? Yeah.
I don't remember which one started. Yeah.
Okay, this is one about her dad. Why am I so emotional? Okay. This one is called Duke. Oh. And here's a drawing by a bar patron of him in 1966. He was fine looking. Look at that. Looked like he kept his hair nice. My father had two wives simultaneously when I was growing up. Neither one my mother. Henrietta, my favorite, and Tessie. They lived in harmony and actually supported each other at opposite ends of our hometown, Boston. Objectively, that's the most remarkable thing about Duke. But the list of things I know from him about myself and the world weaves around me like the shawls that grandmothers are supposed to make. I feel the nappy wool of his self very close to me. The sensibilities of a charming black bartender, relatively invisible in an economically depressed city in the 1950s and 60s, in a neighborhood trembling on the edge of something called urban renewal, or later called gentrification. We came to think of it simply as urban removal,
That's interesting.
right?
Yeah.
Each weekend I visited him at either one of his two households, trying to slip in between the stepsisters and brothers, step cousins, step aunts, as if I'd been there all the time and was not a weekend guest. I did chores. I went to bed when I was told, but it was always clear I was there for him. We strode through the South End as a team, so clearly cut from the same cloth it hardly mattered if we spoke at all. And the charm and style for which he was known was transferred to me almost by default. It was like being the stars of a rhythm and blues song. Duke, 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 Duke of Earl. He was what they used to call heavyset but neat. My stepsisters, like Perry Mason.
That's kind of how you described him, right? You said
Yeah.
his hair looked nice.
Heavyset but neat. Like you want to hug him. My stepsisters called him Jackie Gleason because he had that same build, wore exquisitely cut clothes, and was nimble and witty. It was magical to me that my father was the bronze doppelganger for a famous star. Coupling that with his being well known and well liked on the block made him a celebrity to me. The different thoughts that come to mind to create the picture of who he was are colorful and varied. The clothes, of course, mohair sweaters, Italian knits, shark skin slacks with knife-sharp creases, perfectly tailored camel hair coat worn just the way that Black men do. My favorite look was crisp Bermuda shorts, black knee socks, and loafers or deck shoes. The tempting mocha of his knees showing between the socks and shorts as he glided down West Newton Street turned the heads of most women and many men. Maybe I liked that outfit because it was one I would emulate. It was one I could emulate. Oversized clothes were in, and we'd go walking in the neighborhood on errands or for a drive to get his car washed. Duke and Little Duke, as we were called by the patrons in the Venice Tavern, the 411 Lounge, and the Regent. He took me on my first trip to an airport. He took me to my first teenage music concert, Jackie Wilson, because he got free tickets for helping the promoter with security. I never could identify the exact nature of his help, though, since he was hardly a muscle man. He even cried if my step-cousins got spankings. When I went to the store to buy his cigarettes, I'd repeat the name of his brand, Herbert Tarleton's, over and over until it became an unrecognizable mantra. But Freddie in Braddock's drugstore knew me. I was allowed to stay up until Duke got in from work. Boston's blue laws usually brought him home by midnight. His tip change jangled in his pockets as he loosened the waist on his pants and then held them up delicately with the hand that also held a cigarette. The other hand usually clutched a mayonnaise jar full of iced water. He moved elegantly across the room to sit at the kitchen table with contentment written across his face. If he'd had too much to drink, he moved even more elegantly. He was a man happy to have family, and having two of them was only one of the indications. He, like the women in my family, loved to talk. He'd sit at Henrietta's kitchen table for hours, retelling stories about bar patrons, commenting on the news in the American Record, which he had read while eating, watching television, and talking. He would tell jokes with no punchlines, and we'd all laugh until we cried. He laughed until he cried. Turning the pages of the paper, he'd read quietly for a while, then look up at the TV and make a trenchant observation about something that had just appeared on the screen, like that guy, Ross Martin in the Wild Wild West, has the worst collection of fake mustaches I've ever seen since Mona Lisa. And Henrietta, Alan, Bonita, Catherine, and my neighbor's kid who might be spending the night, and I would fly off in gales of laughter again. I had weekly tasks, like all the kids, but mine were related to my father's room. I'd spent hours there just between, I'd spent hours there just between with his, I'd spent hours there just being with his things, reading his stacks of magazines, Gentleman's Quarterly, Negro Digest, Ebony, Yachting. He read the last one regularly, though to my knowledge, he'd never been on a boat in his life. I read The Well of Loneliness and my first James Baldwin books from the unceremonious pile of novels that grew and shrunk and grew beside his desk. I separated his cufflinks, straightened his desk, folded his sweaters, and counted and stacked his tip change into the neat piles from which he'd pay me. I'd play his records as I dusted and returned them to their sleeves. Then I would devise a better categorizing system as I refiled them in the newest and many of the contraptions, as I refiled them in the newest of the many contraptions for record storage he was always bringing home. One Saturday afternoon, he asked me who my favorite singers were. I said Billie Holiday and Arthur Prysock. He beamed and said, I always knew you'd have good taste. I was 11 years old, and in the 30-odd years since, I've measured all success against the pleasure that was his expression of that his. I was 11 years old, and in the 30-odd years since, I've measured all success against the pleasure that his expression of pride gave me. At some point, we made a deal. He'd teach me bartending, and I'd teach him Spanish from my high school text. He really wanted to learn Portuguese. That's what his father's people were. But I'd examined the multilingual pamphlets that the Christian Scientists left everywhere in our neighborhood, and I was never able to make sense of them. Our commitment to these lessons didn't last long, however. His schedule was often erratic, and mine became more so as I grew into a teenager. We really didn't mind, though, since the deal had simply been a device to make sure we spent time together. That never changed. I'd always wait up until he got home from work, or when I started going out, he'd wait up for me. He had beautiful hands, which I sometimes manicured. I loved the coolness of his skin, the way his hands looked, both masculine and feminine. He usually wore one of three rings, a Masonic ring with one diamond, or a white gold ring with many small diamond chips, or an onyx ring with a small diamond in the center. He advised me to never wear diamonds to a job in front of white people. He said that no matter what they said, they'd be jealous and not want to pay you properly. He also warned me that gold cars blow up. Not an outlandish admonition, in line with the fact that 3 gold Cadillacs had just done that to him. He departed from his usually rather conservative beige or blue Cadillac one year to purchase the gold one. Its engine exploded. The dealer quickly replaced it with another. Its engine exploded. The dealer immediately replaced that with another. It caught on fire. It's like a conspiracy. My father declined a fourth and switched instead to a muted pink with assorted customizations thrown in, along with a free tour of the big Cadillac showroom for me. That must have been cool. I saw my father intentionally do something to upset another person only once. Every Saturday morning, Christian proselytizers would ring neighborhood doorbells to preach the gospel. They sell copies of the Watchtower. Some people welcomed their visits, usually older folks who received little attention from the outside world or those who'd been anticipating some sort of conversion for years. But at Henrietta's house, it was kind of a joke, seeing who'd be stuck answering the bell and then have the impossible task of getting rid of them politely. I remember throwing myself down on the floor and waiting until they went away from the door because they could see in the house. Once I listened from behind a bedroom door to my 12-year-old step-cousin, Alan, trapped for 15 minutes on the stairwell and able to maneuver them back out the door. Man, because they're hard. One Saturday, we ignored the bell, but my father was half asleep and annoyed as hell. He went to the front door naked as a bird. The only thing between him and the gospel was the door's glass window panes. It was some time before they called on us again, I'll bet. When I think of my father, I hear the sound of excited young voices. Here comes Uncle Duke. The words would be spread through the gang of kids, and we'd be at the door. Before he could close the front gate. When an adult got desperate disciplining one of us, he'd just say, I'm going to have to tell Duke. She'd just say, I'm going to have to tell Duke. All misbehaving ceased. You could almost sense our actual regret at having ever misbehaved at all. I think none of us wanted to risk losing his respect or disappointing him or being sent to bed without listening to him tell stories. My mother, who visited me at my great-grandmother's house where I lived, was beautiful and talented, even glamorous, but she was not one of those ex-wives who was buddies with her ex-husband. She was always cordial to my father, but their relationship was a prickly area we avoided. She had her own family too, so the two of them remained in distinctly separate domains that rarely intersected, only for my Holy Communion, my high school graduation, or looking at old family photos. But my mother's mother and my great-grandmother thought like I did. My father was magic. He seemed to know things that others didn't, or accept new information so easily it felt as if he already knew it to be true. He and Henrietta were, for example, the only adults to like my hair when I got an afro in 1968. Once when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7, he bought us each a pint of strawberries while we were visiting his mother. She looked horrified when she realized we were getting down to the last berry and said, trying not to sound hysterical, now, John, you know that girl's allergic. She looked up as if he too were 7 and said, but mother, we wanted them. In spite of my previous allergic reactions, I never broke out in a rash or got sick that time. It's not a bad thing for a kid to think her parents are magic. When I was in college, he told Henrietta to talk to me about birth control. She was embarrassed. I was mortified. It was a smart thing for him to have done because while living with my great-grandmother provided an extraordinary perspective on life, sex education was not part of it. He was only a bit late. Only once did he interfere in my social life, not with the Bynum's boy, snobby son of local West Indian politicians, or Dennis, the gambler, but with George, whom I'd met through friends and who had lived in New Jersey. I was 17. He'd gotten through his Vietnam tour, but in my crowd, that made him irresistible. One Friday, my father stopped to talk to me before he went to work at the bar. He said George would be giving me a call, but wouldn't be visiting again. I was stunned, but I knew there had to be a reason. He said George drank too much and didn't really have anything to offer me, that he talked with George by telephone in New Jersey, and they'd agreed I should finish high school before I have dates with a boy from out of town. I agree. Mm-hmm. And he said I was smarter than George. I hadn't realized that part until he pointed it out. I thought about it quite a bit and was fascinated that someone else, my father especially, could make a judgment that I was smart, that I might even be smarter than another person. You usually think your parents will live forever. You couldn't exist, your world couldn't exist without them. When Duke got cancer, I figured he was still magic. What's to worry? During the last years of his illness when I was in college, I visited him regularly after class and on weekends as usual. The stepkids always left us some time alone, although they still hung out as though they had although they still hung out as long as they could listen to him tell stories. Being bedridden hadn't stopped his mouth. Once when I was with him, he said rather abruptly, "You know Alan's a faggot?" There was no special inflection. He might just as easily have said, "You know your cousin is a Democrat?" But it was much like when my grandmother had used the word bulldagger. Words from their world not meant to harm but to describe. Of course, I knew. Of course I knew. I thought of Duke's friends from the bar, Maurice, Miss Kay, drag queens that he regularly served at the bar and in his home. I wasn't sure what he was saying. I wanted somebody else to know besides me. I liked that he kept watching out for our futures even then. I wish I hadn't told him I was a dyke and everything was all right, that Alan wasn't in it alone. Having two wives at the same time didn't seem unusual to me when I was a kid, but it never seemed unnatural in my family, in my father. As I grew older and examined it from all sides, I applied the socioeconomic realities, the polygamous theories of Afrocentric culture, the philandering male archetype. I decided none of these applied to Duke. Essentially, he liked women. He liked talking to them and spending time with them. Something else we had in common. Actually, he liked people. That's why he surrounded himself with them and talked about them all the time. Maybe that was his magic. He slipped into a coma while watching the Red Sox on TV. Not uncommon in Boston, that would have been a Duke joke. He slipped into a coma while watching the Red Sox on TV. Not uncommon in Boston, that would have been a Duke joke. Henrietta and I sat with him until the game was over. I hated to let him go. Wow.
Was such a great description of her daddy by Jewelle Gomez. It's been quite a few years since I read these essays. Happy Tuesday. We're a mess over here now.
It reminded me of when your father passed away. I think that's what it was making me think. How you sat with him after he passed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, babe. Okay.
She's a really good she's a really good writer though. I mean,
yeah, Jewelle Gomez. It seems like whenever I mention her, people haven't heard of her, but I, of course, read her quite a while ago.
Well, she does have a website. I guess if you were to Google her, but this book was made before they started putting that kind of stuff, because I've had it for quite a while. And it came out in like 1980, 1993.
93.
93, yeah. Which to some people is like a lifetime.
Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Tuesday. Again, my name is Lynn. Last name is Wood. I'm a student services assistant at East Los Angeles College. I'm the coordinator for a center called One Zone. It's a support and retention center for our LGBTQ plus students. And if you need assistance navigating the system that is set up for students, that's Connex Ed or Cranium Cafe, you need assistance on the student information system, you need assistance just getting registered in general, trying to motivate yourself to enroll, I understand totally. Send me an email. Reach out on social media if you have that. I'm on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I'm sorry, I was trying to get you to encourage people to vote.
Oh yeah, sorry. That's super important. You still have time to register if you haven't registered to vote. Please do register if you haven't registered. Super important. We can't let the election go by without exercising the right that so many people have died to provide for us to be able to do.
And they would take it away from us
in a heartbeat.
In a heartbeat if they could, especially Black people.
Yes, people of color have been systematically excluded from voting, and Trump is trying to spread misinformation now by telling people to go to the poll and vote and then to send in your mail-in ballot.
Who does that?
Obviously, you can only do one of those for your vote to count. So if you send, my plan is to not mail in my ballot, but to go to my polling place, and it's a drop-off center as well, so you don't have to stay there and vote. You can just drop off your mail-in ballot there. That would be the best plan of action in this COVID world. But again, my name is Lynn, and I'm a student services assistant at East Los Angeles College. Please do vote. There's voter information on the ELAC website. It's elac.edu. You scroll all the way down, you'll see the information at the bottom of the page. If you can't find my info, you can always go to elac.edu, and in the search bar, type in One Zone, and you'll find me. My card pops up there, and you can connect social media or Connex Ed or Cranium Cafe. Okay, so thanks again for tuning in. Appreciate it. I'll be back on Wednesday at 3 p.m. on Facebook Live reading. I'll probably continue reading Unapologetic. Close to finishing, so I'd like to finish that book if possible. I wish you peace and love wherever you are, and thanks for reading today, Anne.
Thank you for letting me read.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.